If you have hazel eyes, your DNA is telling a story that scientists only recently learned to read. For years, we thought eye color was simple, brown or blue, dominant or recessive. But researchers have now discovered that hazel eyes are actually the product of something much more complicated. Ancient migrations, genetic mixing, and mutations that happened thousands of years ago all converged to create this rare eye color. And the science behind it is incredible. Let's start with what we actually see when we look at hazel eyes. They're not brown, they're not green, and they're definitely not blue. Hazel eyes are something entirely different. A unique blend of multiple colors that seem to shift and change depending on the lighting, the clothes you're wearing, even your mood. The iris contains less melanin than brown eyes, but significantly more than blue or green eyes. This moderate amount of pigmentation creates that distinctive appearance of brown, gold, and green all mixed together. But here's the fascinating part. Mautimau, that color isn't coming from a special hazel pigment. There's no unique pigment that exists just for hazel eyes. Instead, what we're seeing is the result of how light interacts with the specific amount of melanin present in the iris. It's physics meeting biology, and it creates something that looks almost magical. The phenomenon responsible for this visual effect is called Rayleigh scattering. When light enters an eye with a low to moderate amount of melanin, the shorter wavelengths, the blues and greens, scatter much more readily than the longer wavelengths. This scattering combines with the small amount of yellow-brown pigment that's actually present in the iris, and together they produce that shifting greenish-gold appearance that makes hazel eyes so distinctive. This is the same physical principle that makes the sky blue and sunsets orange. It's the same light physics that's happening in your iris. Every time the light changes, the way those wavelengths scatter changes, which is why hazel eyes seem to change color throughout the day. In bright sunlight, they might look more green. In artificial lighting, they might appear more brown. In candlelight, they might show off those golden tones. It's not that your eyes are actually changing color, it's that the physics of light interaction is creating different visual effects. But understanding what hazel eyes look like is only half the story. The real mystery is in the genetics, and that's where things get incredibly complex. For a long time, scientists thought eye color was determined by a simple dominant recessive system. They taught it in every high school biology class. Brown eyes were dominant, blue eyes were recessive, and that was that. Parents with certain eye colors would have predictable children with certain eye colors. It was simple, clean, and completely wrong. When geneticists actually started studying eye color in detail, they realized they'd been oversimplifying something that was far more intricate than anyone had imagined. The key to understanding hazel eye genetics lies on chromosome 15. Specifically, two genes work together to control your eye color, and they're located right next to each other. The first is called OCA2. This gene provides the instructions for making a protein called the P protein. This protein is involved in the maturation of melanosomes, which are the cellular structures that produce and store melanin. Think of it like a factory that manufactures and packages the pigment that colors your eyes. The amount of functional P protein that your body produces directly determines how much melanin gets deposited in your iris. More P protein means more melanin production, which means darker eyes. Less P protein means less melanin, which means lighter eyes. But OCA2 doesn't work alone. Right next to it is another gene called HERC2. This gene is absolutely crucial because it doesn't directly produce any pigment itself. Instead, it acts as a regulatory switch for OCA2. It's like the control room that decides whether the factory is running at full capacity or at minimal production. A specific sequence variation within HERC2, something called a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP, controls the activity of the OCA2 gene. When you inherit a certain version of this SNP, it reduces the expression of OCA2, which means less P protein gets made, which means less melanin gets produced. This is how blue eyes are created. But if you inherit a different version of this SNP, the reduction in OCA2 expression is less severe, which means a moderate amount of melanin gets produced. This moderate melanin level is exactly what creates hazel eyes. Here's what makes this even more fascinating. The OCA2 HERC2 locus accounts for the greatest proportion of eye color variation in humans. These two genes sitting next to each other on chromosome 15 are the primary control centers for determining whether your eyes will be brown, hazel, green, or blue. But, and this is important, they're not the only genes involved. Researchers have identified at least 16 different genes that can influence eye color. 16. That means the hazel eye phenotype requires a very specific combination of genetic variants across multiple genes. It's not like flipping a single switch. It's more like conducting an orchestra where multiple instruments all have to play their parts in precisely the right way to create the final sound. This is why predicting eye color is so difficult. Scientists have discovered that eye color doesn't follow the simple Mendelian inheritance patterns that we learned in school. It doesn't follow classical dominant and recessive relationships. Instead, it demonstrates both epistasis, which means one gene influences the expression of another gene, and incomplete dominance, which means the heterozygous genotype doesn't produce the dominant phenotype. What this means in practical terms is that two brown-eyed parents can absolutely have a hazel-eyed child. Two blue-eyed parents can have a brown-eyed child. The genetic combinations are far more complex and nuanced than simple inheritance models could ever explain. The fact that you can inherit hazel eyes without either of your parents having hazel eyes is actually one of the clearest pieces of evidence for this polygenic complex inheritance pattern. If hazel eye color were determined by a single gene, this wouldn't be possible. But because it's determined by the specific combination of multiple genes, with various SNPs and genetic variations spread across different chromosomes, it absolutely can happen. Your parents might carry recessive alleles for genes that code for hazel eyes, but those genes might be masked by other genes they carry. When those genes recombine in you, they can express in a completely different way, resulting in hazel eyes, even though neither parent has them. Now let's talk about where hazel eyes actually came from. When did this trait first appear in human populations, and how did it spread across the globe? This is where the story gets even more interesting because it involves human migration, genetic mixing, and evolution happening relatively recently in biological terms. Early human ancestors living in Africa, in the bright equatorial sun, all had dark brown or nearly black eyes. This makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. High levels of melanin in the eyes, just like in the skin, provide protection from ultraviolet radiation. In a sunny equatorial environment, protecting your eyes from intense UV radiation is crucial for survival. Everyone had brown eyes. But then, something remarkable happened. As human populations began to migrate out of Africa and spread to higher latitudes, the amount of available sunlight changed. In Europe, in northern Asia, in regions much further from the equator, the sun is less intense and there's less UV radiation overall. In these environments, the evolutionary pressure to maintain high melanin levels decreased. Your eyes didn't need to be as dark to protect you from the sun. This opened up the possibility for genetic variations that produced lighter eye colors to persist in the population. These variations wouldn't have been selected against the way they would have been in equatorial regions. Scientists have identified the specific mutation responsible for the entire spectrum of light eye colors: blue, green, and hazel. This mutation occurred relatively recently in human evolutionary history, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. That's incredibly recent when you're thinking about human evolution. It's just a few hundred generations. This mutation involved a single nucleotide change in the HARC2 gene in a regulatory region that controls the expression of OCA2. This foundational mutation is what made light eye colors possible in the first place. But once this mutation was in the population, other variations could then build on it, creating the spectrum of light eye colors that we see today. The most widely accepted theory is that this mutation first appeared in a single individual living somewhere in the region around the northwestern Black Sea. From there, it spread outward as populations migrated, as people mixed and married across different groups, as civilizations rose and fell and people moved around. This is called a founder effect. A beneficial trait, or in this case a neutral trait, that didn't reduce survival, appeared in one founder individual. And then because that individual had descendants, the trait spread to larger and larger populations. Eventually, over thousands of years, light eye color variations became relatively common in European populations, and less common, but still present in other parts of the world. But here's the key point. Hazel eyes didn't arise from that single original mutation. Hazel eyes are more recent still. Unlike blue eyes, which are thought to have originated from that single founder mutation in that single ancient individual, hazel eyes likely arose from the intermingling of different ancestries. They emerged in regions where populations with genes for brown eyes mixed with populations that had genes for lighter eye colors. This genetic mixing could have occurred in multiple locations and multiple times. Areas like Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa historically served as crossroads for trade, for migration, for conquest, and for cultural exchange. These were the places where different populations with different genetic backgrounds came into contact with each other. The genetic recombination that occurred in these regions is what eventually produced hazel eyes. This is why the geographic distribution of hazel eyes tells such a clear story. Hazel eyes are found in areas with a history of genetic mixing between populations with different eye color genetics. They're more common in regions where you see a lot of genetic diversity and admixture. They're less common in regions that had more isolated populations for longer periods of time. The distribution of hazel eyes is literally a map of human migration and cultural contact. In the United States, the prevalence of hazel eyes is notably higher than the global average. While hazel eyes are found in only about 5% of the global population, they appear in approximately 18% of the American population. Why? Because America is a country built on immigration and admixture. People came from all over the world, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, from the Middle East, all of these different populations with different genetic backgrounds mixed together, and that genetic mixing created an ideal environment for hazel eyes to become relatively common. People with Irish ancestry, German ancestry, Spanish ancestry, and Middle Eastern ancestry are particularly likely to have hazel eyes. These are all groups that have genetic backgrounds suited to producing hazel eye color when combined with other genetic backgrounds. In regions like the Middle East and North Africa, hazel eyes are also relatively common for similar reasons. These have been areas of significant genetic admixture and cultural exchange for thousands of years. In Northern Europe, hazel is certainly possible, but brown eyes are actually more common than you might expect. People often assume that Northern Europeans are mostly blue-eyed, but the reality is more complex. There's significant eye color diversity in these regions. In Asia, hazel eyes are less common but still present. In regions like sub-Saharan Africa, hazel eyes are quite rare, though they do occur. The variation in hazel eye frequency across different populations is a direct reflection of the history of genetic mixing in those regions. There's another fascinating aspect to hazel eye color that we haven't discussed yet. Most of us think our eye color is fixed from birth, but that's actually not quite accurate. Babies are frequently born with blue eyes, even babies who will eventually have brown eyes. This happens because babies are born with relatively low melanin levels in their irises. The pigment hasn't fully accumulated yet. In the weeks and months after birth, melanin begins to accumulate in the iris, and the eyes change color. A baby born with blue eyes might develop green eyes by 6 months, then hazel eyes by a year, then darker hazel eyes by age 3, or even brown eyes by age 5 or 6. This process isn't determined by any additional genetic changes. The genes that determine your eventual eye color are already there in your DNA from conception. But the pigment takes time to express and accumulate. Different melanin pathways activate at different rates, and it can take years for the final color to fully develop. This developmental process has implications for understanding hazel eye genetics. It means that some people might actually be born with genetic instructions for hazel eyes, but they go through intermediate eye colors on the way to their final hazel color. They might appear to have blue eyes as a newborn, then green eyes as a toddler, then finally settle into hazel eyes as a child. Parents sometimes report that their child's eye color changed dramatically over the first few years of life, and this is exactly why. The complexity of hazel eye genetics also means that there's actually significant variation within hazel eyes themselves. Not all hazel eyes look identical. Some hazel eyes have brown as the dominant color, with just flecks of green and gold around the pupil. Other hazel eyes have green as the dominant color, with brown and gold towards the outer edges. Some hazel eyes are more golden, some are more greenish. Some shift dramatically depending on lighting and clothing colors. This variation within the hazel eye category is the result of subtle differences in the genetic combinations that produced those eyes. Each combination of variants across those 16 different genes creates a slightly different phenotype, a slightly different visual result. Scientists have identified specific SNPs that are particularly associated with hazel eye color. Beyond the RS2.91832 SNP in the HERC2 gene that's associated with blue eyes, there's another important SNP called RS18407 in the OCA2 gene itself. This SNP is particularly associated with green and hazel eyes. When researchers study the genetics of people with hazel eyes compared to people with brown eyes or blue eyes, they find characteristic patterns in these SNPs. People with hazel eyes tend to have certain allele combinations that are distinct from the combinations found in people with other eye colors. These aren't absolute predictors. Remember, eye color genetics is complex and probabilistic, but they're strong associations. If you know someone's genotype at these key SNPs, you can make educated guesses about their eye color, though you certainly can't predict it with 100% accuracy. The research on eye color genetics has become increasingly sophisticated in recent years. Genome-wide association studies, or GWAS studies, have identified associations between hundreds of genetic variants in eye color. Some of these variants are in genes you might have heard of. Some are in genes that seem to have nothing to do with pigmentation at all. The genetic regulation of pigmentation in the eye involves a complex network of genes and regulatory elements. It's not just about making melanin. It's about making the right amount of melanin, distributing it properly in the iris, and doing this in a way that interacts with the light scattering properties of the iris tissue itself. One particularly interesting finding is that there's evidence of selection for the blue eye alleles. This suggests that at some point in human history, having blue eyes might have been advantageous. Perhaps it was sexually selected. Blue eyes became fashionable or attractive. Perhaps there was some other selective advantage that we don't fully understand yet. Long-range haplotype tests show that the genetic variants associated with blue eyes have signatures of positive selection in European populations. The blue eye alleles spread faster than you would expect if they were just neutral mutations drifting through the population. This doesn't necessarily mean hazel eyes were selected for or against. Hazel eyes appear to be more of a byproduct of genetic mixing rather than something that was directly selected for. They're an emergent property of the combination of different ancestral genetic backgrounds. Another important point about hazel eye genetics is that it's not something that's purely determined by inheritance from your parents, in the simple sense. While your parents contribute the genetic material, the specific combination that you get is the result of random genetic recombination. During the process of meiosis, when your parents' cells divided to create the eggs and sperm that eventually combined to make you, genetics, crossing over occurred. Segments of DNA from your maternal and paternal chromosomes were exchanged and recombined. This means that your specific combination of genetic variants might be unique. You could inherit alleles at the OCA2 locus from your mother and different alleles at the HERC2 locus from your father or any other combination. The specific combination you end up with might be completely novel. It's possible that no one in your entire family history had exactly the same genetic combination for eye color that you have. This randomness in genetic recombination is also why genetic counseling for eye color is so difficult. Parents often ask geneticists what color their child's eyes will be, and the honest answer is that it's almost impossible to predict with certainty. Even if you know the eye colors of the parents, and even if you know the genotypes of the parents at the major SNPs associated with eye color, you still can't predict the child's eye color with complete confidence. The genetic recombination is random, and the expression of those genes is influenced by factors we don't fully understand. So what does all of this mean if you have hazel eyes? It means you're part of a relatively exclusive club. Only about 5% of the world's population shares this trait with you. Your hazel eyes are the result of thousands of years of human migration, genetic mixing, and evolution. They're a physical manifestation of your ancestry, a biological reminder that your family comes from regions and populations that mixed with other populations in genetically productive ways. The genes that created your hazel eyes were shaped by ancient history, by the movements of peoples across the globe, by the mixing of different ancestries. Your hazel eyes are also a testament to the incredible complexity of genetics. They're an example of how a trait that seems simple, just eye color, is actually the result of an intricate genetic system involving multiple genes, multiple regulatory elements, and complex patterns of inheritance. Every time you look in the mirror and see that blend of brown, green, and gold, you're looking at the physical expression of this genetic complexity. You're looking at Rayleigh scattering in action. You're looking at 16 different genes working together to produce a specific phenotype. You're looking at the end result of genetic mixing that might have occurred hundreds or thousands of years ago in your family history. The science of hazel eye color also tells us something important about genetics more broadly. It shows us that many traits we think of as simple are actually quite complex. It shows us that inheritance patterns are more intricate than the simple dominant recessive models we learn in school. It shows us that predicting genetic outcomes is often much harder than we think. And it shows us that the human genome is full of fascinating complexity, with networks of genes interacting in ways we're still working to fully understand. Researchers continue to study eye color genetics, and there are still mysteries to solve. Why is there so much variation in hazel eye color? Why do some hazel eyes look almost green while others look almost brown? Are there other genes involved that we haven't identified yet? How exactly do the 16 genes identified so far interact with each other? These are questions that scientists are actively investigating. New techniques for genetic analysis, like large-scale genome-wide association studies and advances in understanding gene regulation, are revealing new insights all the time. The genetics of eye color is a field that's still evolving. What we do know is that if you have hazel eyes, you have a trait that's the product of remarkable genetic complexity, ancient human history, and the physics of light. Your eyes are literally changing color throughout the day due to how light scatters off the melanin in your iris. Your hazel eye color is the result of a very specific combination of genetic variants across multiple genes, a combination that couldn't have occurred without the historical genetic mixing of different human populations. And the fact that it's relatively rare, found in only 5% of the global population, makes having hazel eyes something genuinely unique and special. The next time someone asks you about your eye color, you now know the real story. It's not just genetics, it's not just biology, it's also physics. It's human history, it's thousands of years of population migration and mixing. It's evolution responding to environmental pressures, and it's the remarkable complexity of the human genome expressing itself in the color of your eyes. That's what hazel eyes really are. A window into the incredible story, written in your DNA, a story that's been unfolding for thousands of years, and a story that science is only now beginning to fully understand and appreciate. Your hazel eyes are proof that the simplest traits are often the most complex, and that genetics is so much more fascinating than anyone could have imagined.